welcome to the first episode of Hate on Hate. My name is Mike Stryker, and we're going to be covering a lot of different topics throughout the series. Some will be political, some will be not so political. Just whatever topics interest me in the moment. Lots of current events, um, lots of looming political issues that affect this country, this country right here. Um, I think that there are a lot of divisions. I think there's a lot of divisiveness in this country. I think there are parties who profit from this divisiveness. I think a lot of it doesn't need to be there. I think all of it doesn't need to be there. Um, so I'm going to try to do what I can to clarify points and at least shed some light based on my perspective of a lot of the current issues and things that are happening in this country. Um, that this country is the greatest country in the world. I fully believe that with all my heart. I think that the underpinnings of this country are such that this is the only country in the world where you can come here with nothing and become something. For all of the problems that we have in this country, I think it has to be said that there is more potential here than any other country in the world. So I love the US. And I think that if you're living here, you should love the country. If you don't love it, you shouldn't be here. That's my take on people who live in this country. So, as I promised, we're going to be covering lots of different topics. Like I said, some will be political, some won't be political. I'd like to start off with something that's pretty light for most people. Well, maybe not so light for some people. And that topic is the U.S. national soccer team. I'm not sure how many of you follow soccer. Or football, as it's appropriately named. But for those of you in the know, the U.S. team was eliminated from the World Cup qualifiers last night by Trinidad and Tobago. Um, I'm not going to call myself the most educated soccer fan ever. I recently started following soccer after the 2014 run in the World Cup, which I thought was absolutely amazing. Um, so I will comment on last night's game after having watched it. I will say that I think that the entire U.S. soccer program needs a complete overhaul. Everybody involved with that program needs to go for one reason or another. Um, you'll see a lot of commentary on YouTube, lots of videos discussing what the problems are with the U.S. soccer team. Um, my take on the situation is that first problem is the problem that we have with soccer in general in this country. And that problem is in order to become noticed in soccer, we essentially have a system in place called pay for play. And what that means is you have to have a lot of money to become noticed and to play for a reputable team and have a chance of making it on, a U.S. national team or something of that nature. Um, that's wrong. It shouldn't be that way at all. Um, the best players in the world play with urgency. They play with determination. They play with grit. Those players are not necessarily all rich players. If you look at countries like Mexico and Brazil, Argentina, um, countries that have some of the best soccer teams in the world, what you'll notice is that a lot of the people playing on those teams are not necessarily people coming from money. A lot of them are very poor people that grew up poor, but they grew up with a love for the sport. They grew up with a passion for the sport, and you see it when they play the sport. I don't think that passion is really here in this country. I don't. Not for soccer anyway. Um, I think that far too often, the people who end up playing on these teams end up being people who come from money. And I'm not saying that everybody who comes from money can't play soccer. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is when you grow up in adversity, you when you grow up in adversity, you develop a certain aggression You develop a certain intensity, and you can see that intensity when you watch other teams playing, in the World Cup especially. We don't have that here in the US. So the pay for play system needs to end eventually. It needs to end soon if we're going to make it into the next World Cup and qualify. The next thing I want to talk about is the players who played in last night's game. As many of you who watched the game noticed, we had many of the players who played in the 2014 World Cup. That was 3 years ago. Not a hell of a lot of time, but a pretty good amount of time when you consider the fact that most of the people who played were in their late 20s going into their 30s. So now what we had is in 2017, a lot of our best players were in their early 30s, which is not a bad thing. If you're 30, don't get upset. Not saying you're old. What I'm saying is that in soccer, you're starting to approach the age where maybe your best years are behind you. That's not the case for everybody, but I think that you can say that as a rule of thumb, prime soccer playing years are probably mid 20s to late 20s, maybe 30, and that's about it. We had many players that have played in the 2014 World Cup. A lot of good players. I'm sure all of you have heard of Tim Howard, best goalkeeper that the U.S. has ever had. Probably one of the best goalkeepers in the world, period, if we're being honest. Clearly out of step last night. Clearly lost a step. Still a great goalkeeper, but not quite as quick as we're used to seeing Tim Howard. Clint Dempsey played amazing as usual. One of the older players, but still one of the players that has an intensity that you don't really see with U.S. players. You don't really see that intensity in the MLS. So regardless of what happened last night, I wanted to say that Tim Howard played great. I think that Dempsey played a great game. Um, Obviously, Pulisic did a great job. Um, that being said, I could not understand a couple of things about what happened last night. I didn't understand why Michael Bradley is still on the U.S. national team. Now, I understand that around 2010, 2011, Bradley was supposedly a great player. I wasn't really following soccer, that early on, so I have the luxury of not being biased. But I started following around 2014, and what I noticed is that Michael Bradley looked completely out of place playing on an international level. Okay, now I'm not sure how well he played, in 2009, 2010, 2011, but in the 2014 World Cup, he looked terrible. He was one of the slowest players consistently on the field. No agility whatsoever, no energy, no intensity. He had no business being on the field. Um, so you can imagine my surprise when I saw that Michael Bradley was still playing to qualify for the World Cup next year in 2018. I don't know what Michael Bradley's done to leave such an impression on the coaches who allow him to continue to play, even though this guy's clearly past his prime and clearly not fit to play with even average international players. Um, Michael Bradley needs to go, unfortunately. Now, for those of you who have heard the name Wondolowski but can't quite place it, Chris Wondolowski is the player in the 2014 World Cup match against Belgium who missed what could quite possibly be one of the easiest goals ever presented, one of the easiest opportunities ever presented to a player in the World Cup. Um, I understand that Wondolowski is apparently one of the best strikers in the MLS, but anybody who knows anything about soccer knows that the MLS level of competition is nowhere near the international level of competition. And being the best striker in MLS means literally nothing when you're playing in the World Cup. Like, literally nothing. So, whatever Wondolowski has done in MLS, the guy clearly has no place playing on an international level. So, I'm not really sure what he was still doing on the team, to be quite frank with you. Um, there's enough blame to go around for everybody. I can't mention every single person who I think could have done better. I'm not saying that I'm a better player than any of these guys. I don't play soccer for a living. These guys play soccer for a living. And if they're playing soccer for a living, I expect them to be at a level where they can compete internationally. You see guys like Bradley and Wondolowski out there in the field, and it's no wonder why we can't compete with the other international teams in the World Cup specifically. I think that the closest we'll ever come to winning the World Cup was in 2014, unfortunately. And a lot of that was because of Jermaine Jones. A lot of that was because of Clint Dempsey. There were many players who contributed to that. So it's unfortunate. It's an unfortunate situation. There's not really much more to say about it. I'm hoping that major changes will come about. In a sense, I have to say, I think that this loss was probably a really good thing for the U.S. team because I don't think that major change would have come without such an embarrassing loss. I say embarrassing because the team that we lost to, Trinidad and Tobago, lost 9 consecutive games before playing us and beating us 2-1. So I think that there is hope. I think hope springs eternal, as always. I think that there is no hope with the current configuration, with the current coaching staff in place. I think that getting rid of Jurgen Klinsmann was the right thing to do. I think that Bruce needs to go next. And I think that we need to get some coaches in there who recognize the fact that in order for our players here in this country to play well internationally, our players need to have exposure to international level playing. They can't play here in this country in the MLS and expect to be successful playing in the World Cup. That's my 2 cents on the U.S. game last night. I hope it wasn't too disappointing for you guys. It was slightly disappointing for me, but I am hoping that good things will come about because of the result of last night. Take care, guys. Mike Striker, 8 on 8.